evening. Good evening. Welcome back, to week 7 of Intro to Spiritual Care. In case this is your first time with us, it's all good. Don't worry about it. My name is Renita Walker, also known as the Funky Chaplain. I am the facilitator for this 7-week webinar series. This is week 7. Spiritual care is healthcare. Today, I am going to just give you some talking points to demonstrate that spiritual care really is an important part of healthcare. And I want to talk about how churches, religious institutions, and nonprofits can really take advantage of an opportunity right now to provide spiritual care to a whole group of people who probably aren't getting it. So, again, if this is your first time with us, no problem. At the end, I'm going to tell you how you can go back and watch all of these videos on YouTube at hashtag RethinkTV. And you are in luck tonight because I am going to walk through a brief overview, not even an overview, right? But a look back on what we've already done. Week 7, spiritual care is healthcare, spiritual care as part of our health care model. What are we going to do today? We're going to do a look back and do a little bit of a course review. We're going to do a brief history of clinical chaplaincy so you understand how the idea of spiritual care as healthcare came to be. We are going to talk about spiritual care as an integral part of a holistic healthcare model. And then we're going to talk about opportunities for care. All right, let's get into it. Week 1. We talked about spiritual care 101. We made a differentiation between spirituality and religion. Anybody with us like from the very beginning? Good evening, Dr. Gray. Good evening, Dr. Nate. Anybody sticking with us from the very beginning? We talked about the difference between spirituality and religion. We talked about how spirituality is a broad understanding where I find meaning, purpose, and connection. And we talked about religion being a little more tight, narrow view. This is usually belonging to some kind of organization or institution with a shared set of values, moral beliefs, and practices. We talked about the evolving nomenclature from from pastoral care to spiritual care. And we'll talk about the history of pastoral care. And we talked about how it kind of started as a Christian religious concept, and how in this world we are moving to talking about spiritual care because pastoral care is just very Christian. So if you're not Christian, pastor is maybe not even a term that you would engage with that relates to your spiritual practice. And so when we talk about spiritual care, we make it broader. And we include a whole lot more people. And that's what we want to do. We want to provide spiritual care for everybody, those of religious affiliation and those that don't have religious affiliation. We talked about what spiritual care is. Spiritual care, when I talk about spiritual care, I am talking about assessing someone's spiritual needs and wounds. I am talking about responding to their spiritual needs in the moment. And don't forget this piece, I'm talking about making a plan, right, where they can provide care to themselves. So giving them some tools to provide care to themselves and for us to continue to provide the support that they might need for whatever their spiritual need is in that moment. So that was week 1. Week 2, we talked about cultural competency. We identified cultural, intercultural competency, and we called it competency because we wanted to make it a repeatable skill. We talked about identifying our own social locations. So we talked about how what we come with in our backpack, right? What things may we grew up with, we were given, we were indoctrinated that affect the way that we see and engage with other people. Because remember, I keep saying, don't hurt nobody, don't hurt people. But we want to do more than just not hurt folks, right? We want to give them compassionate spiritual care. So we got to talk about the stuff that we come with that can impact the way that we engage other people. For instance, I gave this example. I grew up in the suburbs. I grew up where college education was a given. And so some of the ways that I engage with the world are going to be different because of that. I may have a little bootstrap mentality hanging on. I may have a little respectability politics hanging on. And if I want to give care for people who are less fortunate, for people who the system has marginalized, because let's talk about this. It's not that they're just less fortunate, it's that the system is marginalizing people. And so if I want to provide care for those folks, I just got to know what I come with. We had a special guest that night. I'm telling y'all need to go back and watch these because Chaplain Baxter, one of my colleagues and friend, she came on and talked to us about her ministry working on her D-men, and she talked about all of the insights that she learned working with a population of unhoused individuals as a part of her D-men project. Go back and watch these things because I'm telling you, they were really, really powerful webinar episodes, and we learned a lot, and she taught us a lot, and it was a great conversation. Week 3, we talked about effective communication. We explored effective communication. We defined what communication is, right? You got a sender, you got a receiver, and communication is the sender sending what they mean, but the receiver actually receiving in line with what the sender meant, right? And so we talked about some of the ways to make sure that your communication is effective, asking the receiver, what are you hearing? Repeating to them what you're hearing so they can say, oh gosh, no, that's not what I meant. And thinking about, and we built on our concepts, right? So thinking about cultural competency and how what I bring with me may actually impact what I'm saying and what I'm hearing. Dr. Gray, I've had a good time at it too. We talked about, we explored storytelling as communication. Often when care seekers come to us, they are telling a story, and sometimes they will tell a particular story over and over again because they're trying to tell us something, and they're also trying to situate themselves in this story. And sometimes people are trying to make sense of things, but I've said before, making sense of things doesn't necessarily take away the pain of a situation, and it also doesn't necessarily help us care in that moment. We can validate, but then we can do meaning making, which is asking the question, what now? In light of all the things that have happened to me, what do I want to do now as I am moving forward? Then we had a vignette. Does everybody remember Lisa? Lisa was our imaginary care seeker. She was divorced. She had health issues that caused her to have to retire from a career. She had a church, but because of COVID and her health issues and her divorce, she felt like people weren't talking to her anymore. She had theological understanding that if she had done all these things right, her life shouldn't be going like this. And so we talked about what underlying communication, what feelings she was giving us when she told that story. That was week 3, effective communication. Week 4, we talked about grief and loss. We defined grief. Grief is a normal response to change and loss. And remember, we talked about how grief is not just about death, but it can be about any changes. It can be about getting a job. It can be about retiring. It can be about marriage. It can be about divorce. It can be about having children. It can be about being unable to have children. But any change or loss, even ones we think are positive changes, can still have grief because it is changing a person's orientation to the world. We talked about the 7 impacts and aspects of grief. Remember, grief is one of those things where we talk about emotions a lot because we're really starting to get comfortable with emotions and emotional expressions and exploring our emotions. But grief is about more than emotions. It impacts our mental health, our psychological being. It impacts our spirituality. It impacts our physical health, our physical body. It impacts our philosophical views. So there's different impacts and aspects that we have to talk about for kind of a broader picture of grief than simply our emotions. That's important, but there's more. I went through my model for grief work. I still am doing grief support sessions every fourth Wednesday where I hold space and I do it in a particular way to help people identify these aspects of grief and explore them within themselves, to provide compassion for themselves wherever they might be in their grief journey, and then to begin to use their imagination to think about a way forward, to think about that meaning making, right? Now that I am this new person because of this grief, what do I want to do now? I also talked about norms and boundaries for offering grief support groups if your organization wants to do that. And again, please don't hurt nobody. Grief support groups are it's critical that you have someone there that can hold space in a healthy way, someone that probably has some training. You listen, in your communities you can look at your social workers, you can look at other healthcare providers, but people that are going to be able to hold space and do it in a way that is healthy and that is not harmful, right? Y'all with me? You can also hire me to do some training for your organization if you want to kind of guide some folks that want to be able to provide this grief support groups. Because one of the things is that if you're going to facilitate a grief support group, then you have to be in touch with your own grief and you have to be willing to walk through your own grief work so that when you encounter others' grief, you're not afraid. It doesn't scare you. The intensity of their emotions is okay. You can sit with it because you sat with your own. All right. Week 5, we talked about spiritual needs. We identified 7 spiritual needs. And one of the important spiritual needs that we talked about was the idea that having a spiritual practice and having resources for spiritual care is very important. And that's where we come in if we are going to be spiritual care providers to the people in our midst and to the people in our communities, then we have to understand that having that as a resource is a vital spiritual need. So I believe we are actually, those of us that are clergy members, those of us that are nonprofit directors, workers, those of us that are ordained preachers, but those of us that are in ministry, I think we are in a very important place right now where if we can help really begin to train people to do these things, then we can provide this vital, critical spiritual need to the communities around us. People need an opportunity to have spiritual practice. And remember, this is not just religious practice, these are spiritual needs. These are outside of simple religious practice. And so you got to always remember that we are always thinking broadly. That, and then we went back to our vignette with Lisa and we began to identify the spiritual needs that we saw in there. And remember a great rule of thumb: when I engage a care seeker, I am using my knowledge and expertise to identify their spiritual needs and to engage when I'm making that spiritual assessment. But as one of my mentors during training would say, when in doubt, check it out. I'm always exploring with the care seeker what they might need because they are the expert on themselves. I'm just meeting them, even if I have a long-term relationship with them as perhaps I'm a pastor, they're one of my parishioners. I still only know what I can see, they're the expert on themselves. So I am always, as a spiritual care provider, I am always exploring with the care seeker what they see as their needs, what they believe they need to engage to be spiritually healthy. And in the end, my goal as a spiritual care provider is to equip the care seeker with tools that they can use to care for their spiritual needs when I'm gone. So, I don't want to create any kind of dependency on myself because I'm not always going to be able to be there. I want to give each care seeker tools that they can use to help identify their own spiritual needs and come up with some creative solutions to get those needs met. All right, that was week 5. Week 6, last week, we talked about spirituality versus religion again because it's important to keep that right in the front, that we are not only talking about religious preference, but we are talking about spirituality, which goes beyond religion. I also think for churches in this day and age, we have a responsibility, and I've said this throughout these weeks. I'm a church kid. So don't misunderstand who I am. I'm a church kid. I grew up in the church. I'm an ordained minister, and I have been a chaplain for 12 years. So the church has a responsibility and truly an opportunity to provide spiritual care, not just to the parishioners that may come into the church, but to the folks who maybe are never going to come into the church. And this is where our creativity is really necessary, because we'll have to figure out how to engage the world around us to really be, and I'm going to use a Christian reference here, to really be the salt and light and provide care for folks that are really hurting, because this world is, economically, we should be impacting our communities. Spiritually, we should be impacting our communities. And this is how we're going to begin to do it, I believe. So we explored how our values should inform our choices and behaviors. And we used our vignette, we used Lisa again to look at what she seems to value from her story, because sometimes I have to help a care seeker explore their values because they've never done it before. I mean, until I was in training to be a chaplain, nobody ever asked me about my core values. So where do we do this, where we help people understand their core values? I think this is important for individuals, but this is also important for organizations to understand their core values, so that when they begin to do planning for activities, for whatever your year of ministry is going to be, when you are beginning to plan those things, do they line up with the values of the organization? If they don't, then you may need to really begin to explore and think about, okay, this doesn't even match what we say our values are, what we say we believe, what we say we want to do. So, if that's the case, then I either need to say that these are not my values, or I need to engage my values to help inform my choices. And again, this is personally, this is organizationally. Now, as an individual, when I get ready to engage with an organization, because listen, I'm a care seeker too. I can't, physician heal thyself. It don't really work like that. You know what I mean? Like I'm a care seeker too. So when I get ready to engage an organization that I may want to join or, do volunteer work with, I'm also going to be engaging their values and seeing if they match mine. Because if they don't, then I need to find somewhere else. This can help for those of us that have a history of trauma and are working on having good boundaries. This can help our yes be our yes and our no be our no. If someone asks me to do something, just because I can do it doesn't necessarily mean that I should. Does it match my values? If it doesn't, I can say no, and I can feel okay about that, because it could be a good thing, but if it doesn't match my values, it's not the thing for me to do. That makes sense. That makes sense. I think really exploring your core values is super important, instead of just kind of being pushed around by life. exploring values can help us make purposeful movement in our lives. And sometimes we talk about purpose as this really ethereal thing, especially in Christian spirituality. We like, oh, God has this purpose for us. And okay, well, what is it? And how are you going to move towards it? How do you figure out what that thing is? Well, one, I'm not an automaton, so God's not controlling me. So God is going to engage me and I'm going to engage God and we're going to work together, right? To be on this path that aligns with my values. I value compassion. I ended up in a job where I am spreading love and compassion to people. You see? You with me? You with me? All right. Well, that's our recap. Remember, please go back and watch all these webinar series episodes because you really will get a lot of important information that will help you provide spiritual care. What we say? Don't hurt nobody, first of all, but this will help you provide compassionate spiritual care to the folks that are coming to you for care. And let me say this before I move on to today, as I finish this recap. Let me say this. Even if you are not a minister, a pastor, a clinical care provider, people that come to you are still looking for care. I'm going to give you an example. Last year, my husband and I finally were in a position to buy our first house. Well, listen, that's scary. Buying a house is like the biggest purchase of your lifetime. We're in our 40s. We're finally at the place where we can buy it, but it's kind of scary and it's uncomfortable. Well, I actually we ended up using a realtor that was a colleague from my chaplaincy training. And he absolutely used his training in the provision of spiritual care to care for all of the feelings that we were having, to help calm our anxiety, to be a non-anxious presence. And when I tell you I felt well cared for in the process of buying this house. And so this is not just, is certainly critical if you are in ministry, if you are some kind of care provider, but really for anyone that wants to not harm people and provide care no matter what your career path is. This information can help you with that. All right, well, let's move on to today. I'm going to give you this brief modern history of clinical chaplaincy because I'm going somewhere with this. Clinical chaplaincy is the provision of spiritual care in a healthcare environment. So, this is a modern history. Chaplaincy itself goes back further than we really need to go for this discussion. We want to focus on healthcare here. So 1925, Richard Cabot, who is known as the father of medical social work at Harvard, calls for a clinical internship like a medical school training for clergy. This internship, would have been in a hospital, so clinical. And this is basically the evidence that our physical, mental, spiritual health has been thought about as being, holistic together for quite some time. Also in 1925, Dr. William A. Bryant, who's the superintendent of the Worcester, that's a heart, y'all know, State Hospital, employed Reverend Anton T. Boysen, a former mental patient, to become the hospital chaplain. And I want to stop right here. I want to get on my little soapbox for a minute because look at this. The first really person to become a hospital chaplain and really impact the history of chaplaincy in the United States was a former mental patient. So now I'm going to be a preacher here for a moment. I have been a clinician and an educator throughout this whole thing, but I'm going to put on my preacher hat for a minute and I just want to talk to you. Nothing And I do mean nothing about the life you have lived and what you have gone through and your suffering and the things that you have engaged in your life disqualifies you from your calling. Run with it, Dr. Nate. Nothing disqualifies you from your calling. Everything that you go through, the divine God, the ancestors, whatever spiritual authority and engagement that you have with your spiritual beliefs, all of that, every bit of that understands who you are, what you've been through, and wants to use all of that to impact the world around you. Look at this. Look at this. The very first, really, this is you can look and see this history, really the first hospital chaplain, the father of this thing was a former mental patient. When I tell you I love that, it makes me happy. It makes me happy. Do you hear me? I'm my daddy's a preacher, my granddad was a Baptist preacher, my great grandfather was a Baptist preacher. I'm trying to stay on task here, but that thing is good to me. It's good to me. And if you've ever read Henri Nouwen, his book, The Wounded Healer, gives us permission to help as we are being helped. I don't need to be perfect to help people. What I do have to do is engage the places where I am wounded, do a little cultural competency work so I can see how all of that impacts my engagement with others so that, again, I don't harm folks and can help folks. But being a former mental patient, being a former drug addict, being a former person struggling with housing, nothing disqualifies you from what you are called to do in this earth. And if you believe that, I promise you, you will change the world around you. And ain't that the point? Ain't that the point? If you are here and you're not changing at least your own sphere of influence, I mean, you ain't got to change the world, but you should be changing your world. All right. By the 1960s, there were several associations related to clinical training in the US. Boysen and a few others formed one institute. The Lutheran Church Council had an institute, a training institute that emerged, and the Southern Baptist Association had a training that emerged. But the Lutheran Church Council, of course, was for Lutherans. The Southern Baptist Association was for Southern Baptists. And so shortly after this, they joined together to form one of the biggest training programs in the US. And there was a split, I think, in the 80s or 90s from that large organization. And so now there's two, but this is pretty much the history of one of the largest accrediting bodies for clinical chaplaincy, clinical spiritual care. So from the very beginning, clinical spiritual care has been designed for the clinic, for the hospital, for the mental health hospital. Okay, so since spirituality is considered healthcare, from the beginning, it's been a part of, well, I shouldn't say from the beginning because medicine is obviously older than that, but from the beginning of the clinical clinical care, I'm tongue tied. It has been understood that this is a part of a healthcare model, and that seminarians, theologians, pastors should be able to provide care on par with doctors. All right. So I got just a few. This is kind of a literature review in a way, because if you're gonna do a thing, you got to do a thing, and I'm a little nerdy like that. There are several. You can just Google and find a lot of information. Spirituality is important to mortality, coping, and recovery. The Joint Commission, which is the largest accrediting body in the US that accredits hospitals, has a standard that hospitals that are accredited by this body have to abide by, and that is that they are able to provide spiritual care upon request to any of their patients. The American College of Physicians, the Association of American Medical Colleges also agree that spiritual care should be part of whole person centered care. So, doctors agree. The Joint Commission that accredits hospitals says you have to be able to provide spiritual care to have this accreditation. And the Joint Commission does do, if you have a hospital, you have reviews where they come in and they will do like a chart review. They will review everything and they will see if this person was provided spiritual care and all of that. In 1992, only 3 medical schools offered courses on spirituality and health. But by 2001, 75 of the 125 schools in the US offered spiritual care courses or spirituality and health courses. And many of those courses are required by those institutions. For reference, the Joint Commission accredits over half of the hospitals in the US. Over half. So more than 50% of hospitals are accredited by the Joint Commission, which says it is important that you care for the spiritual health of the patients that come in your hospital. This is from another article. Our findings indicate that attention to spirituality in serious illness and in health should be a vital part of future whole person centered care. Spiritual care is health care. Another organization says that spirituality positively influences mental health and emotional well being. Well, now here's the thing. As far as I'm concerned, that has made the argument. And the National Alliance of Mental Health says spirituality is important. The Joint Commission says the spirituality is important. The NIH has said that spirituality is important. Just do it. If you ever need to, like, somebody just don't believe you, or you need to, think about how you're going to do this in your ministries, how you're going to begin to provide spiritual care. There's all kinds of evidence out there that it is critical to folks' overall well-being to have compassionate spiritual care, effective spiritual care. All right. Okay, so here's our problem. What are the barriers to spiritual care? These are the things that we have to think about. Well, first of all, clinical spiritual care is by history and design focused on healthcare institutions. So there's a couple things that we got to think about with that. One, what is the impact of healthcare disparities on access to spiritual care and the provision of spiritual care? What if what if I don't go in a hospital? Or what if the hospital that I go in is not accredited by the Joint Commission? I don't get to see a chaplain. I don't get to see a spiritual care provider. What if I don't even have health care? So when I get sick, I'm just at home toughing it out, hoping I don't need to go to the emergency room. But that we're not going to go into that research, but that research is clear too, that there are serious disparities in the access and provision of care, and spiritual care is no different. Spiritual care is no different. There's also a barrier to the education of spiritual care. And I talked about this during that first week, I think. One of the barriers to learning about spiritual care is that it is by history and design focused on healthcare institutions. What about people that are not in the hospital like that? People that are relatively healthy and throughout most of their lives, they are not admitted to a hospital. They are not in serious condition. They don't see a chaplain. What about those folks? They kind of get left out of this equation, getting good spiritual care. And so here is where I believe there is a prime opportunity for religious communities to broaden, one, our theological understanding of what we're here to do. We're here to care for the sick. When you clothed the naked, when you fed the hungry, when you cared for the folks in the hospitals, when you visited folks in jail. You did this for the least of me. So our theological, and this is I am really in my Christian bag right now, because that's my community, that's my sphere. We have a responsibility, a theological responsibility to provide care to folks who are hurting. So listen, institutions are not the overall institutions are not going to save us. We have enough resources, and this is especially for Black folks that are listening right now. We have enough resources within our community. We have enough programs and churches and nonprofits and organizations where we can provide spiritual care to the communities around us if we only see it as our responsibility to do so. This is why separating religion and spirituality is so important, because it's not necessarily my responsibility to proselytize to everyone. And we talked about that in that week 1 too. As a chaplain, it's actually unethical for me to proselytize to a care seeker, because there's a power differential. For them, I'm a religious authority and they're in a vulnerable place. They're in a vulnerable place. So I'm not talking about proselytizing. And listen, I grew up in the 80s and we knocked on doors and went to houses and did all of those things. I'm talking about providing spiritual care that asks for nothing in return. You don't have to come to this service. You don't have to listen to this preaching. You don't have to take this tract. You don't have to take this pamphlet. We are here to care for you because that's our job in this world. That's a broader theological understanding and a broader scope of what we are here to do. We're here to care for the souls, right? We are here to care for the spirits of folks who are hurt and broken by this world. We are here to care for the whole of marginalized people, because some of what happens in a system that marginalizes other people is it dehumanizes people as well. That's the way that you keep people like looking down on them and thinking they're better, is you dehumanize them. But as spiritual people, we have to humanize people again and see them as whole and see all of their needs. And so, yes, we may have clothing drives and food drives and backpack drives and supplies and all of these things, but how are we caring for the spiritual health of Black folks who are watching people that look like them get shot down in the street, of Black folks who are watching uh, 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 um, laws made that are not benefiting us to keep us in the bottom? How do we care for people who are really getting beat down by the structures in our country that are made to keep them down? Well, we ain't gonna step on them too. We're not gonna look down on them too. We need to make sure that we can care for them as well. And I'm really on a little bit of a soapbox here, because I think the church, I think this is really a prime opportunity to begin to look into the future and to begin to reimagine how the church can engage with the world around us. Because listen, there's nothing wrong with how we used to do it. But listen, we always have to be evolving and changing and being creative in how we engage with the world around us. I promise you, when we love folks and we care for them, that's what we're here for. They will see the God in us. They will see our love and our care for them. And I promise you, they will want to know a little bit more, like, okay, well, I mean, let me see what they're talking about. And even if they never come to us, we are to be the light. We are to be the salt. We are to give without expectation. When Jesus healed folks, listen, the folks didn't come back and he was like, hey, it is what it is. You're the only one. There was one that came back, right? And he was like, you're the only one that came back. Jesus healed folks and it was what it was. All right, let me get out my Christian bag, because I try to keep these pretty interfaith so that everybody can benefit from them. So let's talk about some opportunities for spiritual care, that if you are a leader, if you have engagement with folks as an entrepreneur, as a leader in a church or a nonprofit agency, or a some kind of clinical care provider, here are opportunities for spiritual care. And this is just like off the top, but engage with people that are in your sphere of influence and in your leadership groups, and come up with some ways that you can engage the community to provide spiritual care. Now that you know a little bit more about how. One way, interfaith community engagement. Your church organization, the mosque, the temple, the Songhai, which is a Buddhist community, like everybody get together and offer care. Offer care. Don't let folks demonize for you things that are not actually bad. We're going to provide spiritual care, and we want to provide it to everyone with a multiplicity of ways so that all folks can get this care. Engage with specific communities you wish to impact. So we go back to when we talked to Chaplain Baxter during the cultural competency episode, and she talked about how she learned she had to engage with this community of unhoused people and found out what she thought they needed wasn't actually what they needed. She needed to engage with them, to hear them, to hear what they needed. We also talked with Julia Mallory on our grief episode, and gave ways to engage the community. So if you want to impact folks who are grieving, engage with them. You want to do a group for, say, folks that have been widowed, engage with them. Ask them what they need. What do you need? How can we care for you? Explore the needs of the community around you. What is the point of having a church on a corner and the community around you is never changed? What's the point of that? What's the point of that? I'm telling you, going forward, people are going to want to see how you are engaging with the world and the community around you before they continue to give you money and attend your events and all of that. What are you doing with all of this? How are you impacting at least the world around you? Provide spiritual care and engagement with diverse communities with agenda and preaching free support. Don't make people sit through your service to eat. They're hungry. Give. Just give. I know I looked this up before, and I think I don't know who is actually attributed to, but preach the gospel at all times. When necessary, use words. Words are not always necessary. Words are not always necessary, especially when you're providing support. Provide agenda-free support. We're going to have this simply because we want to care for the community. These things can include support groups of all kinds, grief support. You can have folks that are meeting for AA groups. Why not have an AA group if you know a group that needs a place to meet? Why not allow them to meet using your building? I know there's plenty of buildings right now. We're trying to figure out what to do with these spaces now that people have left during the pandemic and are not really coming back. You have open spaces. Engage with the community. See if there's an AA group or an NA group or any kind of group that needs a place to meet. Engage with these support groups. You don't always have to form one on your own. You can just engage with the community around you. And that's also what we talked about with Julia when we had that grief support. You want to have grief support for your community? Engage with folks that are already doing it. You don't have to create, I don't need to reinvent the wheel, as we say. Engage with somebody that's already doing it. Mentoring relationships. Sometimes we looked at our vignette with Lisa, and part of Lisa's problem is that she's disconnected from community because of COVID, because of her divorce. Perhaps having someone that can be in a mentoring relationship with her. And when I say mentoring, I'm not talking about I know what you need and how to agenda free, someone that can walk with this person, preferably somebody that has been through some things and came through, because sometimes when you're going through it, you need somebody else that have been through that can be like, look, yes, this is difficult and I'm a witness, you can get through it. I'm a witness, you can get through it. But putting people together that, folks that have a gift for it and a desire to provide this care, and care seekers that need it. Because if you're a leader, you got to have a network, a community of folks, so that you don't run yourself down trying to provide care to all the care seekers in your midst. But you've got other people that you can use as part of your community of care, right? Partnership with other groups to meet needs. One of the things that is a bit of a pet peeve for me is to have a whole bunch of churches on one corner and they don't never do nothing together. Well, you got 6 churches in a 5-mile radius. If y'all don't get together and have the biggest community event and care for the community and stop acting like rival football teams, stop it. Stop it. Get together. Pool all your resources. If you don't have the resource that someone is looking for, know enough about your community, know enough about the churches and organizations and groups in your community so that you can actually refer someone to a place where they have what that care seeker needs and not see it as a loss to you in any way. We're not trying to get members, we are trying to provide care. That's why we separated this from religion, so that we could really have a different religion. We're looking for members and adherents. Spiritual care, we are providing care to care seekers and expecting nothing in return. Know what else you could do? Anything you can imagine, you can do. Get together, especially with some of the younger people in your midst, because young folks, listen, they got ideas, they have needs as well. Brainstorm with them, come up with what you want your organization, what you want your church, what you want your nonprofit, what your values are, and how you want to engage with the community, and then engage with the folks. The elders have ideas, the young folks have ideas, but have a multi-generational, disciplinary, folks that are social workers, folks that are realtors, folks that are doctors, folks that are chaplains, folks that are everyday blue collar workers. Get together and get creative about how your institution or your organization can begin to provide care for the community around you. Well, y'all, I did not think this was going to end so soon, but here we are at the end of our 7-week journey together. I hope that you learned something that you can take with you to, one, not hurt nobody. Please don't hurt nobody. Please. Excuse me. And number 2, to provide compassionate spiritual care to those around you. Something's trying to choke me, y'all. Excuse me. Where can you learn more? Remember, you can get all of these episodes in this series on YouTube at #RethinkTV. On Facebook, I will continue to engage you all on at Rethinking Church Strategies. And I want to thank Reverend Lakeisha Womack for inviting me to do this webinar for that group of folks, so that we can begin to rethink how churches are engaging with the world around us. We have not honored the changes that are happening. It's okay to evolve and change with the world around us. It doesn't mean we're being controlled by the world or we're in the world, but we got to be able to move with how society is moving, so that we can continue to care for folks where they are right now. So thank you, Reverend Lakeisha, for inviting me to do this. I've had a great time being with you all. If you would like to work with me individually, you're a leader, you're a well-meaning person, you would like to learn a little bit more, if you would like to plan a seminar or a workshop for leaders, volunteers, institutions, organizations, hit me up on the website. I am more then willing to work with you, to look at your values, to help you be creative as you think about providing care and spiritual care, to learn, to implement. I mean, hey, listen, whatever you need, I'm here for you. What we want to do, again, like I said, is we're going to not hurt anybody, and we're going to provide good, compassionate care to the people around us. Well, I thank you for your time. I thank you, those of you who have been here from the beginning and have kept coming back. I will see you soon. Take care of yourselves.